Welcome, everybody. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to introduce Juliette, because she and I have known each other for about 1,000 years and worked together many times in the engagement task force and elsewhere. Jules has a particular interest in behaviour, in how people behave, particularly how leaders behave, that coincides and chimes very well with the work that I do in leadership development. And we've collaborated often on in some of those areas. But I think her talk today is particularly pertinent to where we are right now. In that this last 10, 12 months has been probably the greatest challenge for leaders since World War II. And we live in a very different paradigm now to the way they did then. So there's lots of very interesting areas, and I think you'll find Jules' presentation fascinating. I know I will, and I've already seen some of it. So, I will, with no further ado, hand over to Juliette.
Thank you, Nigel. I don't know how many of you attended Nigel's presentation last month. Looking at the names, I think it might be at least a handful of people. But I'm going to be building on what Nigel talked about in terms of post-vaccine victories and how we really need to shift leadership culture once and for all. And there's fewer places for poor leaders to hide, or certainly for organisations to be able to thrive in spite of poor leadership in the way that they've been able to get away with it pre-COVID-19. So what I'm going to be talking about is building on a lot of Nigel's great, thoughts and ideas around leadership direction, and talk about more of the specifics. So what are the sort of day-to-day behaviours, as Nigel mentioned, that leaders need to engage in at all levels of organisations in order to enable their organisations to maximise performance in a sustainable way as we continue to move through the pandemic and beyond that. So I shall start sharing my slides now. Oops. Okay, so let's start the slideshow. So the advertised, thank you, Nigel. The advertised title of my presentation today was Leading in the New Work Order, but I thought actually let's call it Leading Well, because of course there's a huge difference between leading and muddling through and doing it effectively. I'm going to start with some research about the context. So forgive me for those of you who didn't attend last time. I run a company called Real World Group, which has been around for 20 years. And what we do is we conduct academic quality research, but crucially, we make it practical and applicable to the real world of organizations. And what we particularly focus on is creating psychometric diagnostic tools for individuals, teams, governance boards, and also whole organizations, so that people can assess their leaders and their organizations against what is critical for success, and therefore really create the most successful cultures and the highest performance. And my brilliant colleagues on the Inspire All group, who you all have a connection with one way or another, are fantastic practitioners for actually applying these tools into organizations. So let's start by looking at some of the research then. What are we finding about employees' experiences during COVID-19? And there's, as you've probably read, quite a number of studies coming out. But let's start with one that's by Randstad that came out recently. This is a survey of 2,000 people. And what they found was that 54% of people, so more than half of people in organizations, according to their research, are just going through the motions at work. They really feel they're struggling to give their best in the workplace for various different reasons. In a kind of similar vein, challenges have been uncovered by large-scale Nuffield health surveys, which have indicated that 80% of people who responded to their surveys feel they've experienced a decline in their mental health while working from home during the pandemic. If we then turn our attention to research by the Society of Human Resource Managers in the US, they surveyed 1,100 people and found that 41% of people that responded said they feel burnt out, and 45% of people feel, at the very least, emotionally drained. And what was interesting about their research was that actually younger employees felt more emotionally drained than older employees, and also employees who felt that their leaders hadn't adapted well to leading through COVID were even more likely to feel emotionally drained, which is perhaps not surprising. And we'll look at some of the reasons behind that later. But what we can see from this picture, and this isn't, of course, the only picture, there's lots of research coming out now showing that basically things aren't working. You know, the way that we are required to work is going to be with us for a long time to come, if it ever goes back to, you know, a semblance of what we used to have before. So we need to adapt as organisations. And the evidence that things are likely to stay comes, of course, from talking to people about what they want, and organisations recognising the win-win between you know, employees' needs and their needs about doing things differently. So a great example, which I came across in an article by the wonderful Kate Perlman-Shaw, who's in the audience today, is the Work After Lockdown study, excuse me, which interviewed or surveyed, sorry, 1,000 people from both the public and private sector. This is obviously this year. And what they found was that 70% of people are in no rush to return to the workplace in the ways they were before. 90% of people report feeling more productive at home, and 60% of people enjoy the flexibility of working from home. Now, organisations are cottoning on to this, of course. There was some research published this week by Robert Half executive search firm suggesting that 89% of organisations will be hybrid in the future and just absolutely will not be returning to how things were before. Now, of course, you get the outliers, like you may have heard the chief executive of Goldman Sachs yesterday talking about how he sees working from home as a blip and something that people need to get over because working in the office is the way forward. Well, you know, interesting comments, and we'll see how that goes for him, because at the same time, other organisations in the financial sector, as just one example of many, if you take HSBC, for example, organisations like that have already started to significantly reduce their real estate portfolio in anticipation of things not going back to how they were before. So I'm just noticing there's something in the chat box. I want to make sure that it's not for me. Okay, great. So we can expect that with some outliers, most organisations are going to have more hybrid teams, if not fully virtual teams. And the reason for that, of course, is that both the employers, as I mentioned before, and the employees benefit, because you're having more engaged employees who want to work in ways that suit them better, who don't have to have the daily grind of the commute, who can actually, when their children aren't, you know, distracting them with their needs, when kids go back to school, it will be much, much more suitable for many, many people to work from home at least part of the time, because it provides them much more flexibility to actually get some of their life done as well during the working day that they might completely have to fit into the limited personal time that they have, and also gives them just more flexibility. And then, of course, the win for the organisations, apart from the productivity, is the lower overheads instead. So we know, based on all the evidence, it seems incredibly likely that things are here to stay and that we're not going to go anywhere near back to where we were before. So what that means is, if you take that in the context of, but employees aren't on the whole really happy about how things are going, it suggests that leaders will need to adapt their behaviour in order to, you know, become more effective and more successful as we move into the new work order. I'm using that phrase because a lot of people hate new normal. I don't know why, I don't think it's that bad, but fair enough. So we're going to use a new work order. So leaders need to adapt. So where are we with leadership? And then when we look at surveys specifically about how leaders feel about how things are right now and what needs to, you know, and what they need in the future. Interesting piece of research by Professor Sharon Parker and her colleagues of 1,400 people. It was a global study. They found that 60% of leaders either agreed or strongly agreed or weren't sure, so they were on the fence, that people work less well outside the office. So what this suggests is that more leaders than not have concerns about productivity outside the office. And we can actually see that then in their behaviour. If you look further into the Sharon Parker study, you can find that it's not about age and people being stuck in their ways, because actually younger managers are even less confident that people work well outside the office. And that perhaps challenges some of our perspectives around thinking that, young people, want the world to be fully virtual or to have all the flexibility and so on and so forth. But actually they don't have faith that people work well outside the office too, for various reasons. And then when we look at leaders' levels of confidence, we find in the same study that 40% of leaders expressed anxiety that they don't have the skills and the experience to lead people remotely. And we find, of course, that this is exposing weaker leadership because, Nigel touched on some of the dysfunctional behaviours that are emerging and the ways in which cracks are starting to emerge in our sort of less than optimal leadership cultures in organisations. What we know from day-to-day experience, of course, is that people talk about being micromanaged even more by their leaders. We hear leaders talking about their anxiety that how can I trust people if I can't see them, if they're not physically in front of me? And then at the other end, you've got these incredibly dysfunctional behaviours that organisations are engaging in, such as increasing the surveillance software that they have on people's computers, or by doing some bizarre things like, well, I say bizarre, they obviously make sense for the organisation, but things that are going to have the opposite effect of creating trust, like saying, we're going to call you randomly between 9 and 6 and you better be in front of your computer with the camera on. That might sound weird, but I've heard that on a number of occasions, and from organisations that you would think would know better. So there's some real challenges around there. And what that means, of course, is when leaders start to behave in that way, or I should say managers start to behave in that kind of way, and organisations start to behave in that kind of way, it increases stress, it increases anxiety, it puts pressure on people's mental health. Then what happens, of course, people are more distracted from being effective and their performance reduces, which brilliantly reinforces the cycle. So you're going from not feeling confident about people working your way to not trusting them, to making them work less well, to reinforcing your belief. So we need to break this cycle. So the question is then, what kind of leadership do we need in order to effectively lead a virtual team? I've been doing a lot of research into this recently around virtual teams. And one of the big questions that people ask, of course, is what is the difference between leading a team in real-time settings and leading them virtually? And the answer is not a great deal. Virtual teams are not hugely different from teams that are in the office. When we think about what we need from these kind of teams and the kind of cultures that they need to have, of course we need them to be ready for change. Things will be turbulent forever, let's say. Things were already quite turbulent before COVID-19. COVID-19 was just a brilliant example of how things can break overnight. But we need people to have high levels of change readiness in teams, and so we need to create those conditions. We need them to be thinking constantly, how can they improve both systems and processes in order that we continue to improve and we continue to adapt. We need them to be highly resilient, of course, because as the changes are going to keep coming and keep coming, and so how do we make sure that they feel well and able to cope with things? We need them to give their maximum performance, because while all this is happening, resources are reducing rather than increasing, and at all the same time we need people to remain well, because if they're not well, then of course none of this will be sustainable. Now, if you heard me last month in my sort of brief vignette, I was talking about what are the key factors then that enable these outcomes in teams, based on not just our research, but research from people all around the world. We know that there are key super factors that create these conditions that mean you get incredibly high performing teams that are sustainable. And of course, the first one is that they have people within the team have a sense of meaning. And I'll unpick these in a moment. They feel a sense of autonomy around the work that they do. They feel confident that they have mastery of the jobs they're asked to do. They feel appreciated and valued. They have psychological safety around making new suggestions and really contributing their whole selves to their work. And they feel socially supported. In a virtual team, what does that look like? Well, first of all, they have a sense of how they contribute to the overall vision of the department or the team or the whole organization. So they're not just sort of left kind of floundering, not quite sure how they add value. They're invited to co-create the vision in both big and small projects. Not just a vision of what success should look like, but also how we're going to get there. And they're kept informed when goalposts are moved, One of the best ways that leaders destroy, managers destroy meaning in people's work is they forget to tell them when the wider context has shifted and they're doing work that ultimately isn't on track. They have a sense of autonomy. So far, I suspect you can see this isn't any different to regular teams. Autonomy, that they're trusted to do their job. They are given decision latitude when it comes to their activities. And their manager actually expresses positive expectations that they will succeed in their given tasks or projects or whatever it is. So again, not hugely different, but of course it might be more challenging to do this when people aren't right in front of you. But it's still the same basic needs: mastery, supported to expand their capability. Clarity of expectations is one of the very common ways in which leaders or managers create challenges for individuals and reduce their sense of understanding of what they need to do and therefore their ability to do it. So clarity of expectations, of course, is something you need to go over and above to try to be clear about when it comes to virtual team working, because of the lesser opportunities to get together. Noticing and thanking people, again, when they're not right in front of you, perhaps that's something that you need to extend even more. But appreciation isn't just about the thank yous that make a huge difference to people's commitment. It's also about asking their opinion. How do you think we should do this? What challenges do you think might come about? How might we overcome those? That makes people feel a sense of value, and it's really critical. Also, just for our basic neuroscience, let alone the psychology of how we work. Psychological safety is really critical. So, as we're working in new kind of ways, creating a climate where people feel respected for their ideas. And finally, of course, social support might be the area where we have the biggest challenges because of peers not getting together. So how can managers ensure that they create the conditions where peers can get together and communicate, not just in formal team meetings and so on? So those are the key things. And overall, the key message that we're getting from the research is that leadership needs and required behaviours will not change as we move to virtual or hybrid teams. Some of the competencies might be like the ways that we work, but in general, how leaders operate will not change. It's just the context itself. Now, I'm not going to repeat myself from last time, but what I talked about was that we need to be thinking specifically about leadership behaviours, and we need to be looking beyond leadership personality. Because for all that, personality can be really important in terms of developing leaders or selecting the good leaders for teams and virtual teams, in the sense that we understand their motivations, their preferences. It can help in terms of communication among teams or, among leaders and their teams. But personality does not create or enable these super factors of meaning, autonomy, mastery, and appreciation. So we really need to be thinking that let's not overestimate what personality can do, and let's look at behaviours specifically. What behaviours do our leaders need to enact in order to create these cultures of thriving? And of course, when we think about leadership behaviours, we know that leadership behaviour culture flows from the top in the same way as any other culture flows from the top of the organisation. And so what's critical as we move forward, as Nigel was talking about last month, was that we have got to get the most senior managers, so that's the executive team or the board, on board with the work that we're doing. It's really critical because, you'll have heard all kinds of different, famous phrases like culture eats strategy for breakfast, or, about the sort of icebergs of culture and how it can derail if it's not flowing all the way through. But it really, really is critical that we get this right now. And that means focusing on the day-to-day leadership behaviours and competencies that those very senior people do when they know they're visible and when they think they're invisible, because they all get experience. They're all perceived. So we really need to focus on that. Now, unfortunately, what we find is that boards and executive teams tend to resist reflection. And what we mean by that is, leadership reflection, feedback, and so on isn't as big and as popular as it should be in general, but particularly it's much less common at the very top of organizations, save for the occasional introspection. So you might find that your board or your executive team is happy to undertake a self-assessment about how well they're doing, so they can sort of, it's teach them marking their own homework, or they might engage in some kind of introspection like a collective MBTI or some other personality assessment. And not that that's not useful, but that is so limited in what it's going to tell them. They really need to reflect on what they do well, and the behavior bit being key, and what they do not so well. Because as the fantastic Mark Twain said, it genuinely isn't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you're convinced you're clear about and you understand. That is the big problem. And I'll give you some examples of real life boards shortly that illustrate very clearly how, I want to think of a more polite word, but how delusional boards can be, or executive teams can be, about their performance compared to what they think, and how we need to, in the nicest possible way, enable them to see that so that they can adapt their behavior, because it's not rocket science. It's simple common sense behaviors, which I'm going to talk about now. So what should boards and executive teams be doing? So the research we've been conducting, for several years has been looking at specifically what are the characteristics of high-performing boards or executive teams, strategic teams in general. And I'd happily share the research with you, of course. Now, there are what we've classified as then 8 dimensions of what a highly effective board or executive team engages in, which you can see in this diagram here. And in essence, there are 3 aspects that they focus on, either intentionally or unintentionally. The first one is that they utilize engaging leadership behaviors. What I mean by that is that they are visible, they walk around, talk and listen. They actually care about the well-being of their wider organization. They actually want to involve people in conversations. They want to consult rather than being completely introspective. They want to build a shared vision with stakeholders. They're basically about we rather than us or me as a board or a team, and they demonstrate that they're not just about the boardroom, but they're actually interested and appreciate what the much wider people in the organization bring to the organization's performance and success. They also enact, of course, essential governance competencies. And here what we've found is particularly they are very good at, for example, translating the vision into meaningful goals and objectives. They are very good at managing and balancing the need for risk control versus not stifling innovation and doing things differently. Of course, there's compliance with legal requirements and things like that. But there's a whole range of governance competencies that, of course, that they undertake too. And I'm going to do a deep dive into 4 of the dimensions in a moment. So I'm giving you just an overview now. And the final thing, and the thing that is often overlooked, is that they actually behave like a high-performing team. So we need to give boards and executive teams the opportunity to actually reflect on, are they a pseudo team? Are they just a collection of highly competent people who've been brought in from different areas of their expertise, or do they actually operate as a collective in effective ways? And we'll unpick that in a moment. So those are the 3 key areas that are covered by the 8 dimensions that we have in our model of high-performing boards and strategic teams. And what happens, as we can see from our research, as a result of boards and executive behaving in these ways, is that first of all, the board or the executive team's own engagement and well-being is increased as a result of these competencies, behaviours and team behaviours. It also enhances the engagement and well-being of the senior managers who report to them, and then therefore they're creating a really positive role model for how those people should behave throughout the organisation. And last but not least, we can show that they significantly increase the commitment of external stakeholders to working with them, but also external stakeholders are more likely to say that they have confidence in the board or executive team, that they will achieve their objectives and that they will achieve the vision the organisation has overall. So it's a triple win when boards and executive teams behave in these kind of ways. And let's look specifically at what they do when they're high performing. And if we look through the lens of, first of all, which of the 8 dimensions most strongly influence and which of the specific behaviours influence the board or through the strategic team's own engagement and well-being. So the first one is around personal qualities of value. So this is what our research has shown are the really most powerful factors in terms of the board's own engagement and well-being. First of all, it's a sense that values and principles are integral to the mode and operation of the organisation, that the individuals on the board or team are willing to be held to account for performance of the organisation, that they are willing to stand up and support senior managers as appropriate, and that they place customer care and safety at the core of the vision of the organisation. The next one is more about the team working behaviours, that they understand and respect each other's roles on the board, and that they appropriately use each other's expertise, that they support each other so that they, use each other's expertise best, that they feel that they turn ideas into action effectively, and that some sort of, nuts and bolts stuff, like that they feel that the board meetings or executive team meetings are focused predominantly on strategic issues and not moving into areas that are operational, which of course is a temptation all the time. And also that they feel that they make timely decisions as a group rather than putting things off. And then when we look at, so those are the things that make the biggest difference to the engagement levels of the team. When we look at what makes the biggest difference to the well-being of the board or the executive team, it's the dimension, the behaviours under constructive challenge, which describe things like encouraging people to operate in ways that are open and respectful, but also being willing and able to challenge each other in a respectful way, and being able to challenge data presented to them and experts that present to the board. Being willing, I should say willing, to modify ideas after they've heard other people's views, rather than being absolutely fixed, and also being able to handle conflict well. So those, as you can see, like none of these are rocket science. They're all simple common sense behaviours, but they are a combination of the board's competencies and how they enact those competencies. So neither competencies nor engaging behaviours nor high performing team behaviours will be effective on their own. It's the combination that's critical. And then when we look at what most strongly influences the engagement and well-being of the senior managers that report to the board, it's interesting, I think, that that's a different dimension. So the board needs to be engaging in ways that don't only just, make them more effective as a team, but internally, but also that are doing the right things externally. And when we look at then what increases, that has the biggest influence on both the engagement and well-being of senior managers that report to the board, it is behaviours such as consulting with employees at all levels on strategic issues, and even inviting them to join board discussions when their experience and knowledge will help decision making, will enhance decision making. They walk around, they talk and listen to people. They don't just assume they're going to get the right information. They communicate positive expectations of what senior managers can achieve. They monitor progress on delegated tasks in a constructive and supportive way, because those of you who work with boards who are on boards or work with executive teams will know that it's so common for those people to be doing the job one level below them, or even two levels below them. But actually the most effective boards, of course, and teams, they let go and they demonstrate that they believe these senior managers will do a brilliant job. So they monitor in constructive and support. They offer support as is needed, and they encourage senior managers to use their discretion and initiative in determining how they perform their job rather than micromanaging them. And they champion diversity and inclusion by embedding fair and ethical behaviour in the organisation. So if you look back to the meaning, autonomy, mastery, appreciation, and so on, they're absolutely reflected, particularly in this dimension. I mean, they appear in other areas too, but it is, again, it's those behaviours. You can see how it kind of reflects all the way from the top. The ways that the board or the executive team motivates the senior managers is exactly the kinds of ways that we want our senior managers to work with our middle managers, with our junior managers, with our frontline staff, so that we can create a culture throughout where we're getting higher levels of readiness for change and well-being and performance and so on and so forth. So so it's all very well knowing what needs to be done, but how, but then the key thing is boards reflecting, are we actually enacting these behaviors in real life? So here's some examples of boards and executive team in terms of some of the behaviors that are measured under the model. And these come from real life 360 application of the tool. The first one is around communicating positive expectations, and what we can see. So this is an item that says board members communicate positive expectations of what staff and managers can achieve. And what you can see in the blue line is the board members' self-perceptions. Internal groups 1 and 2 are actually senior managers, 2 different groups of senior managers that report to the board. Now, bear in mind that where that red line is, 4.5 is where the ratings go on average from slightly agree to agree. So you don't, unless you go past the red line, in general, people don't agree. They slightly agree or less that you engage in these kinds of behaviors. And as you can see, the board perception is quite different. Mind you, it's not brilliant, is it? Even the board isn't completely convinced. They're not strong. They're not, meaningfully into the agree category. So they recognize to a degree that they perhaps could improve in that area, but the perceptions of the senior managers are much less positive. They're only just into the slightly agree category. So really important feedback for that board to take on board. Another one around encouraging discretion and autonomy, and recognizing that empowerment is so critical. Nigel talked about this last month as well. We have to let go, we have to release potential. So this is critical. And what we're seeing here, the question here is the board members encourage senior managers to use their discretion and initiative in determining how they perform their job. Neither the board nor the senior managers agrees that this is true. They slightly agree. So obviously you unpick this with the board and try and the people giving feedback and work out where this might be happening, or who might be doing this and who isn't, or where it's not working. But it's not exactly covering them in glory. And then finally, let's look at visibility, walking around, talking and listening, which is absolutely critical as well to engagement and commitment. This is an example from an executive team, as you can see. So the blue is the executive team, and the green and the pink are the senior managers that report to the executive team. Again, I'll show you the red line, and those black lines, they're range bars. They're showing the maximum and minimum response from within those different groups. I mean, that's not great, is it? I mean, when it comes to boards, we're talking about a mixture of executive and non-executive. Now, even when we've done work in Australia with boards who are fully non-exec, and we've helped advise people like the Australian Institute of Company Directors, they recognise, and they brought us in because they recognise that it's critical that even non-execs are visible and that they connect with the organisation more widely rather than staying in their ivory tower. But you can sort of see how, you can argue very much that the executive team have got a particular responsibility to be connected with the organisation. And what you can see here is that with pure executive team responses and pure executive team feedback, this is really not happening. And look at the massive variation as well. That's really important for executive teams and boards to understand too, is that there seems to be quite a huge range of experience among those senior managers of the executive team. So consistency is another issue that they need to be thinking about. So hopefully you can sort of see how, and presenting this kind of feedback to top teams might help them to sort of, also, these examples might help them to recognize that even if they don't do it, even if they don't reflect using a formal diagnostic tool like ours, but at least gathering feedback in some way or another that isn't just introspective navel gazing is really critical. So I'm going to end now with some suggestions for leaders in terms of enhancing. I'm just going to check the time. So I've got 6, okay. So suggestions then for leaders, and this is leaders at all levels, to enhance virtual or hybrid team working. The first one is to be humble and to ask for support. This is a brilliant time if you're not that confident as a leader, or the leaders you're working with aren't so confident, to really be able to be vulnerable, because everybody's learning, everyone's been chucked at the deep end. This is a great time to not feel exposed for your lack of confidence or whatever it is. Invite team members to co-create successful virtual working. One of the issues that I'm sure everybody who's attending today knows is that leaders think that they have to have all the answers, and that to not have all the answers is a sign of weakness or lack of competence. But this is another great example where we can't have all the answers. Each team and department and organization and sector has got to shape their own ways of working in a hybrid or a virtual way. And so we need to get the input from the key stakeholders, who are the people who are doing the work, which is the team members, and of course stakeholders too. But the idea is that we start by co-creating successful virtual working. And it's not just in terms of what kind of behaviours people will engage in towards each other, but also how we will share knowledge, how we will overcome the challenges that are brought by not being face-to-face, so that we can benefit from all the other opportunities. And things like the basics of things like version control, because if we work vector-view and people work at different times of the day or night, how can we make sure they can see a history of a document, for example, that we might not have thought about so much before? Find out what individual people need. Do they need, for example, greater support from you as a leader? Do they need greater clarity? Do they need some development? And then critically take a leap of faith. Hopefully what I was able to explain, of course, from the first diagram, the sort of circular, not trusting people to work at home, to behaving like you don't trust them, to creating more anxiety, to a self-fulfilling prophecy, is absolutely true in leadership. Whether you believe in people or you don't, you will get what you expect one way or another. So it's really critical that once you've checked people have got what they need, you get out of their way and let them get on with their job. Because if you don't, then you'll get what you expect. You won't get the performance that you could. Increased self-awareness and empathy regarding mental health. Stress is significantly increased among people, partly because of home circumstances and the pandemic, partly because of whole new ways of working, and partly because of the way leaders haven't adapted sufficiently, because leaders were already the biggest cause of stress in organizations. So we've always got to look at ourselves first, or our clients need to always look at themselves first as a potential for challenges. But but the point is, we're not going to suddenly emerge from this with everybody feeling well and not stressed. It's going to be a long journey. So in the meantime, we need to increase people's self-awareness that it's okay to talk about mental health and think about it more as a continuum than a deficit. And next month, of course, the brilliant Carolyn, who's here today, will be talking more about mental health and well-being. We need to think about mental health the way that we think about physical health. It's not we're well or we're unwell, that we could improve. It's not okay versus not okay. Most of us could always improve our mental health in some way or another. And some people might be really struggling, and there's no shame in that. So that's critical for us to start to raise. And then, of course, providing your team members with support. And as I mentioned before, encouraging peer support and bonding time. So things like, how can we utilize technologies like Zoom, not just for meetings that, to discuss performance, but also just to socialize, to discuss things together. And then, of course, the support from OD and HR colleagues. And my last point as well, I should say, as we move toward being able to be face-to-face and we think about teams being in the office, that making sure that those occasions are not just occasions when, it's a focus on work, but also on the social aspect. But then when we think specifically, excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold, about what specifically OD and HR can provide, first of all, of course, consider what policies need to change to enable hybrid working. Obviously, examples are IT expenses, flexible working, and so on. But looking at this really is critical, because what these are emerging now as is often contradictory to what's being asked for or espoused. Provide meaningful support for leaders to rethink performance appraisal. Another area where there's a big deficit in most organizations, of course, is performance management, either in terms of competence or confidence or both. Or time to do it. We need to, as experts in OD and HR or working with it, help them to help leaders and of course themselves to rethink performance as results-based rather than presenteeism or all the other kind of unfortunate and not very helpful measures that they've either consciously or consciously applied in the past, and a much greater feedback culture of ongoing support. Encourage the language of emotional well-being versus mental health problems, which I talked about before. And one of the things that can help is talking about 4 in 4 rather than 1 in 4. And what I mean by that is, when we talk about mental health, we often say, but it's normal. Just don't worry about it. Don't feel anxious about it. Don't feel, because 1 in 4 people will experience a mental health episode in their life, or every family will have somebody. That itself is exclusive language. It's better to talk about, as I said before, that all of us experience a degree of mental health challenge, whether we call it being more stressed or whether we call it being more anxious or whatever it is. All of us sort of fluctuate in terms of being brilliantly well or awfully unwell or unhappy. So we're all a continuum at some point. So I'm not saying everyone goes from those two extremes, but I mean that we all know that there are degrees of feeling better and not so well, and so we need to talk about it as a universal experience rather than, oh, we don't feel weird because it has happened to 1 in 4 people. That Carolyn will be much more articulate about this when she talks next month. And then another thing to bear in mind, this is my second last point, is exploring consistency and expectations of uniformity versus innovation. Nigel talked about last week. We must break down silos. We must avoid tribes. And so it's really important that we create collaborative efforts in organizations, but don't let expectations of uniformity get in the way of the necessary, unique ways of working that teams and departments will build. And in local government, one of my experiences, people talk about one council, which is a really important drive towards becoming, collective. Some of those can sort of counteract important differences. And then finally, of course, I was banging on about earlier on, try to persuade strategic leaders to reflect on their behavior and their impact, and specifically through the eyes of others rather than just introspectively. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Nigel, hopefully, to take questions.
Yes, you are. I have a couple of questions that are prompted by what we've just been doing. One of the things that it says to me is that we have a cohort of leaders at several levels in organizations who actually don't know what their job is. Because what you're suggesting here is all the things that, and I agree, all the things that leaders should be doing, well, most of them aren't. So that either suggests that they don't realize that's what they're supposed to be doing, or they don't know how to do it, or they don't agree, or the other. I see examples of all three of those, but it seems to me that we need to kind of redesign what being a manager and leader actually is about. Because it should be about all the things you've just spoken about, which follows on from some of the things that I've spoken about and the others have spoken about before. But it clearly isn't at the moment in the majority of cases. Most managers and leaders I encounter don't actually have a job. They define their job as being in charge of something or some set of results. The rest of us have all got a job. We know what we have to do all day. They often don't. Once you get sort of middle manager upwards, their job is often expressed in terms of what other people do, the people they're responsible for, or the area they're responsible for, rather than what they do. So they've managed to duck this issue for decades because they've not been measured often on what they achieve. They've been measured on what the people they represent achieve. That's an interesting. So, I don't know, what do you think? Is there something we need to be doing about that?
You may be surprised to hear that I agree with you, Nigel. And yes, I do think. So thank you for asking. And I think it's I can't help but keep thinking that what's happening with COVID and the leadership needs of COVID are just an exaggeration of what we already needed. So we've already known that for far too long, the behaviours I just talked about are not included in performance appraisal. They're not included in selection. They're not included in promotion. And they absolutely, this is the burning platform. It's literally exploding on fire. We need to get these things formalised and expected, because otherwise they won't get done. So yes, there's a whole re-education piece that really needs to accelerate now.
Well, because that creates the challenge in itself, doesn't it? Because the people at the top of the organisation are these people. So how are they going to work out that they're not the right people and then recruit someone else to replace them? Generally speaking, that isn't the way it works. The turkeys don't vote for Christmas. So
No, but
So
I mean, I have seen, Nigel, excuse me interrupting you, I have seen some real Damascene conversions of even chairs of boards when they get exposed to the idea that perception is reality and perhaps their reality isn't the only reality, and that actually what the benefits are of these so-called soft skills. I have seen some genuine transformations. So I don't think it's, I mean, obviously I've also seen people leave boards as a result of what's emerged, but you know, it presents a choice and many people will want to get on board. They just didn't realize, is my sense. So I don't think we need to, I think if we make them, if they start to worry that they might get replaced as a result of reflection, then they're not going to let us in to help them to rethink. I suspect you agree with me on that, and seeing you nodding. But I don't know if other people have experiences of boards, and or other people's reactions or thoughts to the presentation or challenges. Any of the above are welcome.
we could all join hands and put that the living hell.
Hi, Kate.
Hi, you're right.
I'm
Great
very well, thank you.
presentation. I'll talk to you soon. I'm wondering about some of what you're just discussing in the Q&A is very familiar to me, but I've been wondering about appetite and what appetite you've been discovering for the softer side of things. I hate that word, softer side, but for the what I've been, suppose in my writing, calling sort of the amateur psychology side of stuff. What appetite are you finding out there? Because I wonder whether my experience recently has been a bit skewed, because the people who are contacting me are the people who are interested in this. So I'm not actually meeting the people who aren't. So I'm just interested in other people in the field. Are you discovering an appetite for this out there at the moment?
Carolyn?
Sorry, trouble unmuting there. I'm not finding, thanks Jules, that was a brilliant presentation, and all very, very relevant. I think to answer your question, I think there isn't a huge appetite, and it's one of the really frustrating things, particularly for me, and obviously I'm going to be talking next month about sort of a culture of care and well-being, but I often use the term for the soft side of bikes and bananas, and that often what we do when we go in for well-being interventions is we go for the bikes and the bananas. And what I'm seeing happening specifically in the leadership field at the moment is almost going back down to that level. So almost every other contact I'm getting is, can we do some upskilling of our leaders in terms of understanding mental health, because they're dealing with hybrid teams, people working from home, and you sit there and you're talking about recognizing whether your staff might be a bit unwell or not, and you're trying to explain the signs and the symptoms, and you're thinking you're missing the point here. This isn't what you need. You don't need to be raising awareness about mental health issues. What you need to be doing is raising awareness about the leadership skills that are required to lead remote teams. And as Juliette said, they're no different really than the same skills we've always needed. But I think, you know, you could hide behind it. Before we were managing remote teams, you could almost hide behind the fact, as a manager, you could hide behind the fact that you maybe weren't that emotionally intelligent as a leader. I think it's more obvious now when you get these horrendous stories that Jules has just talked about, you know, where you get people saying, I'm going to phone you at some time between this time and that time, and you've got to be sat in front of your laptop, and if you're not there, I mean, what does that say about trust? You know, and the fact that we're not recognizing that people are having to work different hours. You know, people are homeschooling, all of these things. We've got people getting up and working from 5 in the morning till 10, taking half a day off, and then coming back and working later, and that's fine. If that's what works for you as an individual, that's fine. But I think companies are still massively missing the point with this whole leadership area and mental health and yeah, generally.
Yes, absolutely. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, because you're right, and you've all said this in one way or another, that, you know, these are the skills we've always needed. Suddenly, they're also the skills we've never had. So this hasn't changed that. It's just exposed it and shone a light on it. There's all kinds of reasons, I guess, why we haven't had those things. But one of the ones I'd offer is that we've always valued dynamism and extroversion as kind of traits of a leader. And generally, although I'm quite dynamic and quite extrovert, so I'm pointing at myself here. But one of the things I think that bothers me about that is that it's got nothing to do with thinking or reflection. They're often the least likely people, in my experience, to spend time thinking deeply about things. They value action. So you never get to the end of a sentence. I have colleagues like this. Never get to the end of a sentence before they want to know what it is they're going to go and do. And that behaviour that Karen is describing, that sort of box ticking mentality, I think, is driven and exacerbated by that desire to get on with it rather than to understand it.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think, though, in response to your question, Kate, that people are starting to naturally look beyond personality. That is my experience. Is they're sort of saying, you know, and the problem is it's limited, of course, to people that know there's an alternative, because people are. I've had